What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. In today's video, we're going to be discussing auto subs and in relation to player fatigue within Madden 22, and we're going to specifically talk about the nature of auto subs and what exactly they mean. As you can see on the screen here, in order to get to your auto subs in franchise mode, you're going to go to the Home tab, then you're going to scroll down on your activities page to manage staff and go to auto subs. Whenever you enter into the auto subs menu, it's going to have an auto sub set for both offense and defense. You're going to have individual auto sub sets for every single position that's going to determine how often or if at all a player at that position is going to sub in or out of the game. Whenever you first start off here, every single auto sub slider is going to be set to a sub in amount of 80 and a sub out rating of 60. And in the top right corner, it's going to give you a description of what it says auto subs are doing. It says auto subs change the frequency of this position. Insert any position for one of these. It is going to change the frequency of players being substituted in during that game or substituted out during that game. So the description of these sliders is leading us to believe that this is a frequency slider, meaning a value of 99 would be the most frequent amount of subbing in or subbing out, and taking it all the way down to 1 would be a frequency of almost never subbing in or out of the game. However, I had the recent debate of whether this slider set of auto subs is a frequency slider or a threshold slider. And what I mean by that is, with the introduction of the fatigue system within Madden 22, you now have thresholds that determine when a player will sub in or sub out of the game. A player could be at 75% fatigue, could be at 80% fatigue, or any number given within the fatigue system in the game. And the argument is that this auto sub slider now aligns or correlates directly with a player's fatigue level. So the argument would be in detail that for a running back, if they have a fatigue level of 75, when they sub out of the game, they are not going to come back into the game if you have their sub in number at 80, because a player's fatigue is capped this year in Madden 22 at whatever it is pre-game. So if a player starts a game with a fatigue level of 75 and subs out of the game, and your sub in slider is set to 80, their fatigue will never get up to that threshold of 80 to be able to sub back into the game. And the theory is that this is what is causing so many issues for people having players sub out of games and never sub back in. If your player's fatigue is lower than the sub in number, that is causing them to not sub back into the game. Now, I don't know that I perfectly buy into that argument, because I've had situations where it doesn't exactly work that way, but that does seem to be what happens a majority of the time. You want to make sure that your sub in number is set lower than that player's maxed out fatigue. The only problem here is that we don't actually have a good way to tell what a player or a individual player's fatigue level actually is within the game. So we can go to our weekly training and we can see that our overall fatigue level is at a 91%, but that varies from position to position. Same thing, and I believe that was our defense. Same thing with our offense. You can see the overall fatigue level, but you only get those green bars for all of the individual players. You don't actually get a number that is going to allow you to correlate that with your auto sub slider. Unfortunately, when you click on individual players as well and scroll to their health tab, it also does not give an individual fatigue number for that player. It does give a description of where they're at, and you can kind of come up with a number in your head based on how much percentage-wise, you believe that bar for them is full. So for Chris Carson here, for example, I would say his bar is maybe about 90% full, which means that I would want my sub in number, in theory, to be below 90, because if I want him to sub back into the game when he subs out, his fatigue needs to be able to reach a level that allows him to sub in. If you need a player to reach 90 to sub back in, and Chris Carson isn't capable of reaching 90 stamina or fatigue in that game, then he's never going to come back into the game. Ultimately, you can come up with a pretty solid slider set that is going to allow your players to be in the game whenever they are at their most effective. So my recommendation would be, outside of just knowing a specific number for a given player on a given week, you can set these thresholds to be at a certain level for a player's best performance. So at running back, for example, whenever a running back gets below about 80 stamina, 80 fatigue level, they're going to be at risk of fumbling the football. They're going to be at risk of taking a big hit. They're not going to be able to sprint as fast, whereas a halfback that is 88 and above stamina or fatigue level is going to be able to perform at their top ability. And so for this video, I've come up with an auto sub slider setting for you guys to help alleviate some of those issues of players subbing out and not subbing in correctly. This is something that I've been experimenting with, and it's worked a little bit better than using these as a frequency slider. Instead, we are utilizing our auto subs as a threshold slider that correlates with player fatigue. So let's go ahead and discuss each of these real quick and discuss why we have them set where we have them set. For the quarterback position, we have quarterback sub in at 1 and quarterback sub out at 0. What this effectively does, if we utilize this as a threshold slider, is the quarterback will never sub out because their stamina is never going to hit 0. And they would immediately sub back in because their stamina would very quickly recharge to 1 stamina. What it comes down to is you're never going to want to sub out your quarterback anyway, so we have that set to 0 and 1. At the running back position, your running backs are going to be most effective with a stamina of 80 and up, or a fatigue level of 80 and up. So you probably don't want them in the game if they're below that threshold anyway. So I have this set to currently 82 and sub back in at 88. So they'll sub out in theory whenever their stamina / fatigue level reaches 82, and they'll sub back in pretty quickly once their stamina regains back up to an 88. This also factors in good fatigue management throughout the season, because generally speaking, if you manage your practice reps and everything properly, you'll never have somebody that is below that 88 threshold, which means your running backs are going to come back into the game later into the season when they do have some amount of fatigue, unless they are at a very bad point. Then you may want to adjust these sliders slower. If somebody is super fatigued, you want to have their sub-in slider lower than what you think their maximum fatigue level is. So if I think my guy's really fatigued, then I may want to set this at a sub out example of somewhere in the 70s and sub in whenever they get back up into the low 80s. That's not what we have it set at right now, but keep that in mind as we go through that. That's kind of how we're focusing on this. Now, wide receivers can be more effective even into the low staminas. Their stamina and fatigue level goes down significantly slower than most other positions as well. So we're going to have wide receivers sub out if they get their stamina down to a 60 and sub back in if they get to a 75. Now, that's not going to allow for a whole lot of rotation with your wide receivers, but I've had the most issues with my receivers coming off the field and not going back into the game. This has solved my issue with wide receivers not staying out there on the field when I need them. For tight ends and fullbacks, you're going to want them to be out there on the field and not subbing off too much. So we have them subbing out if their stamina gets down to a 75, which is going to be kind of around where they'll start to lack in performance, and come back in whenever their stamina gets to an 85. Generally speaking, much like the other positions, their general fatigue throughout the season isn't going to drop below that 85 mark. So you shouldn't see guys coming off the field and never coming back into the game. And with offensive line, this is somewhere that I suggest having players sub in more often than most other people who talk about this subject. I like having good backups, and I like to rotate my offensive line because they block significantly less effective if they're tired. So to kind of strike a solid balance here, we're having them sub out if they get to 65, which is a little bit low, but they'll stay in the game probably a little longer than I would normally want them to, but they're only going to come back in if they get back up to a 75. That's going to give them a good amount of space to work with to allow them to have an effective range and allow some substitution, but not taking your guys out of the game so that you're never going to see them again. On the defensive side of the ball, we don't notice fatigue issues quite as much, and substitutions are going to vary depending on what your personnel looks like, if you have the depth to rotate players or not. At the defensive tackle and defensive end position across the defensive line as a whole, we have them subbing out if they get down to a 70, which is again where they're going to be too tired to do anything effectively, and subbing back in if they get back up to an 80, which is kind of the base of where you're going to see optimal performance, 80 and above. When we go to linebackers, we're having them sub out if they get tired at a 78. They're much like a running back position where you'll see a noticeable difference if they drop into the 70s, and they'll sub back in at an 85. This is a position where you'll notice season-long fatigue, so you want to make sure that their sub-in number is monitored closely in relation to how tired or how fatigued your linebackers are throughout the season, so that you're making sure they do have that sub-in number set well enough below what their max fatigue is so that you will see them come back into the game. And last but not least are going to be our defensive backs. Our defensive backs are much like wide receivers. They don't really need to sub out of the game. They aren't going to get tired that often, but you will want to have a base threshold for them. So they're going to sub out at a threshold of 60 and 65. That is, if they get very, very tired, they can sub out, and we'll let them get back up to 75, which no defensive back should have trouble getting back up to. They should never be fatigued enough that they won't come back into the game at a 75. This is just going to make sure that if they get very, very tired, they are coming off the field and subbing in for somebody that's a little bit more healthy and allowing them to take a break. But that's where we have these thresholds set, and this is where I've seen actual improvement in terms of players not coming off the field late into the season and, not staying off the field, for example. They will come back onto the field. I haven't had as many issues with my running backs and wide receivers like I had been having before. I do believe there is therefore some truth to the fact that these are not a frequency slider like Madden says up there in the corner. I do believe these are indeed threshold sliders that correlate with season fatigue and stamina. Now, one thing that I have to address as we speak about this topic is that I have had it where I have had 100% fatigue level. Everybody had a full green bar at the end of a season, or maybe it was in the middle of the season or even early season, and I had a glitch where players came off the field and never came back in, and my auto sub sliders weren't set to anything that would force them to stay off of the field. It was actually very bizarre, and this still happens to me from time to time to this day. The game is glitched, and my personal recommendation is until they really flesh out this system with progressive fatigue in the season, you should probably just turn progressive fatigue off, because you will notice issues regardless of these improved auto sub sliders for you. You're probably going to inevitably see some players come off the field and never come back onto the field because of the glitches here with progressive fatigue. So you definitely want to keep that understanding in mind whenever we go through here. If you absolutely have to have progressive fatigue on, certainly make sure that you work with your auto sub sliders and think about it from a mindset of a threshold slider and not a frequency slider like we used to look at it. In fact, I was just playing a game not too long ago where I had Joe Mixon as well as all of my top receivers never come back into the game. So Jamar Chase, Joe Mixon, and T. Higgins, and I also had Tyler Boyd at the time, all exited the game and never came back in, and every single one of these players is at full health. There is nothing affecting them, preventing them from coming back into the game. There is no auto sub slider that would say that they shouldn't come back into the game. Progressive fatigue is still broken within Madden 22, and I hope that you guys kind of heed my warning with that. Most leagues are actually running with progressive fatigue off because of the issues that we've seen with it, and they do still have quite a bit of work to get done in order to make it work the way that it should. It is a very nice addition to the game, and I like the theory behind it. It just needs to be worked on, much like the scouting update within Madden 22, and we'll have a much better system for it. But like I said, it's one of those things that's going to glitch for you no matter what, and you're inevitably going to see players subbing off the field that should not be subbing off the field and never coming back into the game. And like I said, I do a great job of managing my fatigue level throughout the season, and I always keep it into the high 90s, if not at 100 the entire season, and I still get players that glitch out of the game and never come back. So hopefully you found this video entertaining or useful in some way. Like I said, we are looking at the auto sub sliders from a different mindset now. It does say within the game that they're a frequency slider, but that does not appear to be the case within Madden 22. I have not been able to find any evidence from EA stating that they made a change or that the progressive fatigue changes the way that these sliders work and implement players coming in and out of the game. With all that being said, please make sure you leave a like on the video, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one, and I hope you have a good one.